Global Business Dialogue, a coalition of corporate globalists promoting world government through so-called free trade agreements, sent an email to its members on March 21 praising a speech by Cecilia Malmstrom, a key architect of the disastrous migrant, refugee program that is devastating her native Sweden and all of Europe. Malmstrom, shown, is an executive member of Sweden's Liberal People's Party, which has unsuccessfully pushed for Sweden to replace its national currency, the krona, with the EU's euro. She has also served as Sweden's Commissioner for European Affairs, 2006 to 2010, and, more recently, as the European Union's Commissioner for Home Affairs, 2010 to 2014. In both of those major posts, Malmstrom labored to expand EU controls, at the expense of national sovereignty, and, especially, to undermine border security and do away with restrictions on migration. The migration, refugee swells that grew to a flood in 2014 and a tsunami in 2015 are largely the result of her handiwork. While most Europeans, according to polls, view the massive influx of 1.5 million migrants, mostly Muslim and a large percentage of which are young males of military age, as an unmitigated disaster, Malmstrom has been rewarded by the EU's ruling plutocrats. Specifically, she has been promoted to EU Commissioner for Trade, with a chief mission to win approval for the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, TTIP, the globalist scheme that would merge, economically and politically, the United States with the EU, in much the same way that the formerly independent nations of Europe have been brought under the control of the increasingly oppressive EU oligarchy in Brussels. In its March 21 email to members, Global Business Dialogue, GBD, reported glowingly on Malmstrom's recent address to the Peterson Institute for International Economics. Named for its chairman, Peter G. Peterson, who was also the longtime chairman, and is now chairman emeritus, of the Council on Foreign Relations, the Peterson Institute has long been one of the most influential think tanks promoting global governance. In a wide-ranging and fundamentally upbeat speech at the Peterson Institute earlier this month, noted the GBD email message, EU Trade Commissioner Cecilia Malmstrom talked about the ways in which the United States and the European Union can be supportive of one another. One way the two can support each other, she said, is in our respective relations with other countries. She illustrated that point. The email continues, with a discussion of TPP, noting, for example, that EU firms operating in TPP countries do some $2.2 trillion worth of business annually. The EU's broad trade agenda includes many countries in the Asia-Pacific region. Malmstrom outlined the EU's negotiations for trade relations treaties with TPP countries such as the Philippines, Singapore, Vietnam, Indonesia, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, as well as Japan. The message she intended to convey was that US businesses will be left behind and will face competition from EU firms that enjoy a big advantage, unless they convince the US Congress to approve the TPP agreement. Noting Malmstrom's reference to opposition to the TPP expressed by presidential candidates Donald Trump, Bernie Sanders, and Ted Cruz, the GBD email states, returning to the skepticism about trade on the political front, the obvious starting point is the opposition to TPP that is coming from the leading presidential candidates. In the circumstances, it is quite possible that some of those EU initiatives mentioned above, the agreement with Canada, for instance, and maybe even the one with Japan, could enter into force before there is even a vote on TPP. If that happens, Congress is likely to hear a lot about the competitive advantages being enjoyed by EU firms at the expense of their US competitors in those critical markets. This left-behind trope has been a standard ruse used by adepts of the Peterson Institute, CFR, GBD, and their allies for years to promote multilateral free trade agreements, FTAs, such as NAFTA, CAFTA, FTA, and now TPP and TIP, aka Obama trade. All of these, ultimately, fall under the authority of the United Nations and the World Trade Organization. On the one hand, the FDA globalists warn that if we don't integrate with more nations on trade-related issues, the big, bad EU will run over us and leave us in the dust. On the other hand, they simultaneously argue it is in our national interest to merge and integrate with the great and good EU All-Atlantic Union and the TIP. Malmstrom called for transatlantic cooperation, remarking that since the European Union and the United States have these similar goals, we must support each other's efforts to achieve them. How does she propose this be done? We can do that at the World Trade Organization, said Malmstrom, and we can do it in the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, or TIP. What that means, she elaborated, is building a revitalized WTO agenda to increase the WTO's authority and jurisdiction over labor rights, environmental protection and robust regulation, as well as trade in services. Malmstrom's linkage of the TPP with the TIP is nothing new, at least not in insider circles. The European Council on Foreign Relations, ECFR, the EU counterpart of the New York-based CFR, tells us. The fate of TIP is also linked to the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP, which is further advanced than TIP but is also stuck. If TPP fails, TIP will be harder to ratify. The victory of the generally more pro-trade Republican Party in the midterm elections may help trade policy. Ultimately, the challenge to TIP is the same on both sides of the Atlantic. At a time of economic difficulty, mainstream politicians have found it difficult to make the case for globalization. This behind-the-scenes guidance by the CFR, ECFR, and their various national affiliates in Europe, Latin America, and Asia is to be expected, as the CFR coterie has been the most obvious force driving the globalist UN-WTO FTA agenda. As we reported last year. It is not surprising then that the Council on Foreign Relations has been providing the guiding hands behind the various high-powered lobbying groups, media organizations, and think tanks pushing the TPP, and TIP. This is evident from the content of the CFR website, the articles in its journal Foreign Affairs, the speaker programs it has been sponsoring, its members who are holding key U.S. government posts, and its members who hold top executive positions in major corporations and business associations. CFR member Dr. Michael A. Samuels serves as Secretary of Global Business Dialogue, as well as one of its 3 directors. Dr. Samuels, a former deputy U.S. Trade Representative and U.S. Ambassador to the GATT in Geneva, also serves on the GBD's Board of Advisors. One of Global Business Dialogue's main sponsoring organizations is the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, whose president, Tom Donahue, CFR, is a tireless flack for the corporatist globalist agenda. Moreover, Global Business Dialogue's corporate sponsor roster includes such CFR-aligned heavyweights as Walmart, UPS, Dow Chemical, Unilever USA, Deloitte Touche, Tomatsu Limited, Caterpillar Incorporated, Chevron, Pharmaceutical Research and Manufacturers of America, PHRMA, United States Steel Corporation, DHL Express, U.S. Dairy Export Council, and Fluor Corporation. Over at the Peterson Institute, besides Chairman Peter G. Peterson, other CFR insiders include co-founder and director C. Fred Bergson, President Adam Posen, and more than 24 directors, fellows, and staff members, such as Lynn Forrester de Rothschild, David Rockefeller, Morris Greenberg, Richard N. Cooper, George P. Schultz, Carla Hills, Alan Greenspan, Paul Volcker, and Robert Zoellick. Malmstrom, Sutherland, Goldman Sachs, Soros, Rockefeller. The EU's Cecilia Malmstrom has been moving in these power elite circles for years, working in a particularly close relationship with Peter Sutherland, the Uber insider of global finance and politics. Sutherland, the United Nations Special Representative of the Secretary-General for International Migration, together with Malmstrom, UNICEF Executive Director Anthony Lake, CFR, and UN High Commissioner for Refugees Antonio Guterres, former president of the Socialist International, crafted the migrant-refugee program that is swamping the EU. Sutherland, a fanatic Europhile integrationist, has favored every scheme that would diminish national sovereignty in favor of an ever closer union under the Brussels oligarchs. In a previous report, we noted some of the critically important information about Sutherland that is typically missing from most mentions of him in the establishment media. Until this past June, Sutherland was chairman of Goldman Sachs International, the global banking behemoth known to critics as the vampire squid for its predatory, corrupt practices. He is a regular attendee and former steering committee member of the ultra-secretive, ultra-elite Bilderberg Group. He was European chairman of the Trilateral Commission. He is past chairman of British Petroleum, BP. He is honorary president of the Transatlantic Policy Network, TPN, one of the principal corporatist insider organizations promoting EU-US merger through the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, TTIP. As a principal architect of the WTO, he has been hailed as the father of globalization, and as a top bureaucrat, he played a lead role in destroying national sovereignty by replacing national currencies, and national monetary control, with the euro, as well as engineering the borderless Europe, which the current migrant crisis is now proving to have been so destructive. In a 2012 op-ed entitled Europe's Immigration Challenge, co-authors Cecilia Malmstrom and Peter Sutherland denounced critics of their open borders plan as xenophobic, anti-immigration, and dangerous. The op-ed was published by Project Syndicate, created and funded by billionaire One Worlder George Soros, CFR. In actual fact, it was the Malmstrom-Sutherland plan that turned out to be truly dangerous, as well as being actually anti-immigration, since massive numbers of potential immigrants have simply dispensed with going through the official immigration process and opted instead for migration, simply walking across the border into the EU. And it has engendered the xenophobia they decried, since no nation can absorb and assimilate such large numbers of migrants in so short a time period. This is especially true if the migrants do not desire to assimilate and have no incentive to do so. This naturally, and predictably, causes resentment amongst the native population, which not only is forced to finance accommodations and sustenance for the migrant hordes, but also must deal with the ensuing social clashes and conflicts. However, Malmstrom and Sutherland, far from repenting for their destructive migration debacle, are doubling down, pushing ahead with still more sovereignty demolition, regardless of European public opinion to the contrary. One of their most cherished current projects, of course, is the TTIP. All indications are that they and their globalist confreres intend to be as dismissive of public opposition to that project as they were, and continue to be, with regard to migrant-refugee crisis. In her Peterson Institute speech promoted by Global Business Dialogue, Malmstrom falsely painted a picture of a TTIP process of openness, transparency, and inclusivity. On both sides of the Atlantic, we need full, frank, open and democratic discussions on trade policy, she straight-facedly said, simply ignoring the secrecy and the corporate exclusivity of the TTIP deal-making. That involves making the case for open markets, she continued. But it also involves listening to the principled concerns being raised. We do that through an inclusive policy of reaching out to citizens and stakeholders. Not only listening but also taking people's concerns into consideration. If the trade agreements we propose are to have people's support, we will need to actually take good ideas on board. In a column for the UK's Independent, John Hillary reported on a conversation he had with Malmstrom that indicates her reaching out and listening comments are typical politician babble, empty campaign rhetoric aimed at soothing public concerns. Hillary's title says a mouthful. I didn't think TTIP could get any scarier, but then I spoke to the EU official in charge of it. His subtitle is also worth noting. With just 8 words she exposed everything that's wrong with the deal, and why it needs to be defeated. And those 8 words? Here they are, from Malmstrom, as reported by Hillary. I do not take my mandate from the European people. And here is the context, from Hillary's article. In our meeting, I challenged Malmstrom over the huge opposition to TTIP across Europe. In the last year, a record 3.25 million European citizens have signed the petition against it. Thousands of meetings and protests have been held across all 28 EU member states, including a spectacular 250,000-strong demonstration in Berlin this weekend. When put to her, Malmstrom acknowledged that a trade deal has never inspired such passionate and widespread opposition. Yet when I asked the Trade Commissioner how she could continue her persistent promotion of the deal in the face of such massive public opposition, her response came back icy cold. I do not take my mandate from the European people. Emphasis in the original. Likewise, when it comes to the TPP, many members of Congress, especially those who are members of the Transatlantic Policy Network headed by globalist Sutherland, do not take their mandate from the American people. Neither do they allow their oaths to defend the Constitution to hinder their support for internationalist schemes that violate the Constitution and undermine our national sovereignty. Efforts to derail and defeat the TPP and TTIP are substantial, and they continue to grow, but they will fail unless the lies and duplicity of officials such as Malmstrom and Sutherland and their counterparts in the White House and Congress are thoroughly exposed, along with the globalist agenda, which aims, ultimately, to use regional schemes such as TPP and TTIP as building blocks for an all